legalized for adult use, and both Vermont and New Hampshire are on the cusp of becoming the 9th and 10th states, respectively. This list is only growing, including initiatives in New Jersey and New York. Despite this, Attorney General Sessions continues to threaten states with medical and recreational use. However, 70% of U.S. voters oppose federal government interference. It's time to legalize marijuana, protect patients, and right the wrongs of prohibition. This is where the Marijuana Justice Act changes the game. Until recently, federal marijuana legalization bills have failed to thoroughly address the lasting impacts of decades of prohibition and punishment that disproportionately impacted communities of color, low-income communities, and veterans. This is not just another legalization bill. The Marijuana Justice Act is the first bill in Congress to deschedule marijuana while also providing retroactive expungement for people with previous marijuana convictions. Convictions that oftentimes shut out folks from, especially people of color, from the now booming legal market. It includes a resentencing process for those in federal prisons for marijuana-related charges. And probably my favorite part of the bill, as a native of the Bronx, shout out to Morris Heights and Highbridge, a community reinvestment fund that is dedicated to communities most impacted and most devastated by the war on drugs and marijuana prohibition. I am honored and thankful for the leadership of everyone at this table. And with that said, I'd like to turn to our House lead sponsor, Congresswoman Barbara Lee of the 13th District in California, representing Oakland, for her remarks.
Thank you very much, Queen. And let me thank all of you for being on this call and being with us today. And I have to thank Senator Booker for your tremendous leadership on each and every issue of justice and equity. You're not only there, you've been leading for so many years. And to my colleague, Congressman Ro Khanna, boy, he has hit the ground running.
Yes, he has.
Here from Silicon Valley, right next door to my district, and it's such an honor to introduce this bill, the House version of Senator Booker's bill, with you. And I have to just say to Drug Policy Alliance, your work has been remarkable. We never would have gotten to this point had it not been for you. And believe you me, this legislation will end this destructive war on drugs. We intend to do that. So we're here to announce, of course, the introduction of the Marijuana Justice Act. And believe it or not, here on the first day, we have 12 co-sponsors in the House, which is really remarkable, really remarkable. It's a roadmap not only on how we're going to end this war on drugs, but also begin to address mass incarceration and the disinvestment that has taken place in communities of color. But it goes much further also than just legalization. This bill is really an essential step in correcting the injustices of the failed war on drugs, as Queen said, namely the racial disparities in marijuana arrests and incarceration. The bill provides a path for people with certain federal marijuana charges to expunge their records. It would also help those currently serving time for marijuana convictions to petition for resentencing. It also forces states with records of racial bias in sentencing, and there are many, and arrests to clean up their act, finally, by cutting funds for law enforcement and prison construction for the worst offenders. And finally, it would provide for a new reinvestment fund directed toward communities that have been devastated by the failed war on drugs. Restorative justice is extremely important in this effort. We all know that it's not just enough to expunge records and end over incarceration. These victims of these failed policies deserve support during the reentry process, including job training, legal assistance, and more. This issue has never been more urgent than it is today. Attorney General Jeff Sessions' decision to rescind the Cole Amendment could have devastating consequences, not only in my home state of California, but states throughout the country. And we know who is most likely to suffer from a revival, and that's what his actions would precipitate, and that's a revival of the war on drugs in terms of marginalized communities and people of color. So I believe that the Trump administration has made really a major miscalculation. People understand that marijuana criminalization has failed. That's why more than 60% of Americans support legalization. We're committed to this goal, but we also need to get it right. And people of color, the victims of the policy, need to be at the forefront of this effort. with the Marijuana Justice Act, we have an opportunity to forge a new path, one that's inclusive and one that is just. So I want to thank you again. This is a new day. Not only are we fighting back, but we're moving forward. Thank you.
Amen.
Thank you for
Now I would like to yield now to Senator Booker.
Did Congressman?
I think you should go.
Okay. So I just, first and foremost, want to thank everybody who's at this table right now. These are friends of mine and heroes of mine. The Drug Policy Alliance, by the way, I was a young city council person in New York City, first ran into a man named Ethan Nadelman, who was the original head of it, and he was the first person who sat down and talked about marijuana policy with me and enlightened me on a lot of the data that I wasn't aware of. And to have you at the table here today, many years later, is really extraordinary. So thank you for being here. Barbara Lee is a champion for justice, has been, not since she's been in that Congress, but she's been a champion for justice, has a career of doing that, a lifetime of doing that since you were a teenager, frankly. You've been an activist. I've seen the pictures. She and I both had different hair. Well, I had hair back in those days, and I'm just so pleased. She's been a partner, a friend for a long time. And Congressman Khan is like a brother to me. We are so similar in our work and our approach. He's a passionate pragmatist and really has, as you said, hit the ground running. One of the bright stars here. So to have them lead this bill in the House, these two folks, it makes a big difference to me. I'm going to be very brief because I'd like to get to your questions, but I just want to pull out a couple of pillars. Number one. There's all this Russian enthusiasm about legalization going on everywhere from California to New Jersey. To me, it strikes as hypocrisy and injustice if you legalize but don't try to undo the damage that was done by this awful war on drugs. The fact that there are people wallowing in prison right now or who are having lifetime sentences, in other words, with a criminal conviction, you can't get a Pell Grant, you can't get food stamps, you can't get many business licenses for doing things that 3 out of the last 4 presidents admitted to doing publicly. We have a real depth of hypocrisy if we don't make sure that as we move towards decriminalization, legalization, medical marijuana, we undo the damage that was done, not to every community, but that was targeting certain communities, vulnerable communities. And we now have a devastating reality in America where communities of privilege still flaunt their use of marijuana, still talk about it in a cavalier manner with no fear of consequences or retribution. But there's communities like the one in which I live, in the Central Ward of Newark, New Jersey, where you can see the devastation, the punishing impact of young people who get caught up in this web because they're targeted for marijuana enforcement. So I see this as not just opening the gates to using marijuana. I see this as trying to restore some sense of justice, some type of restoration for the decades and decades of damage done to this community. This is one of the greatest assaults upon low-income people. The war on drugs has been one of the greatest assaults on people of color since Jim Crow, and it's time that we undo that damage. And that's why this is a very happy day for me to be sitting here with these two Congress people who have the courage to lead, tell the truth, and to continue to try to make this nation live up to its promise of being a place of liberty and justice, not for some, not for the wealthy amongst us, not for the privileged among us, but liberty and justice for all. With that, I turn to the Congressman.
Well, it's such an honor to be at this table. Senator Booker, your courage and vision on this issue before it has become trendy or popular. You've been a voice for legalization of marijuana when it was very, very difficult. And you're a real trailblazer on so many issues, but on this I just want to thank you for your political courage in putting this bill out there. And Barbara Lee is also a person of extraordinary political courage, from her opposition to unjustified wars to her opposition to the Hyde Amendment. I mean, both of you have really led on issues before they became the consensus. And so that's a great example for a freshman congressman to see. And to the Drug Policy Alliance, thank you. I don't think anyone has done more work in building a coalition in Congress on this issue. And it's not often the members, it's groups like yours that are going to be effective to get this bill through, and your leadership has been terrific. I'll be brief and just talk a little bit about the economic part of the bill. And there are 2 points I want to make on that. One is the estimates are that the legalization of marijuana industry would be about $40 billion, nearly 1 million jobs, and a tax base of almost $7 billion. And that $7 billion will more than cover the $500 million in your and Barbara's bill to help invest in these communities. So this is actually a net gain for the government. It's a net gain for job creation, and it is makes economic sense. But I think the economic impact is so much broader than just that $40 billion. You talked about the disparity of treatment, and I had read Chris Hayes' book, A Colony in a Nation, and he talks about very openly having weed at a stadium and being given a second chance and not having a criminal conviction. Now, he became and has become one of the lead journalists in the nation. How many people of color are there who may have been Chris Hayes, but at 19, 20, 25 did something where they didn't get that leniency? I mean, you're probably talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of lost economic potential. And that's what's so bold about this bill. It's not just talking about legalization. It's giving people a real second chance by getting rid of that criminal past, which is stifling their opportunity and their future.
Thank you all for your remarks. Those are really great. And with that, we should turn to Q&A so we can maximize our time.
At this time, we will open the floor for questions. If you would like to ask a question, please press the star key followed by the 1 key on your touch-tone phone now. Questions will be taken in the order in which they are received. If at any time you would like to remove yourself from the questioning queue, press star 2. Again, to ask a question, please press star 1. We'll now hold for questions.
Thank you.
Is there any hold music? Is there anything we can play while we're waiting here?
Now,
Our first question comes from David Matthau with New Jersey 101.5 News.
All right, see, Jersey's first. I respect that.
And Senator, the question is for you as the senator from New Jersey, of course. You know, I'm sure, that efforts are moving forward in the Garden State to legalize marijuana. It's an issue that really does seem to be gaining momentum all of a sudden. Do you agree, sir, that now is the time to address this issue comprehensively? And why do you think things are changing the way they seem to be changing right now?
Well, I think that we've seen some early states move, and there were definitely some stumbling blocks with edibles and proper labeling and things like that we all agree should be done when states are given the opportunity to be laboratories of democracy and reform. But the successes we're having, I mean, as I stood after Jeff Sessions put forward the Cole memo, and I saw a person who was an opponent of legalization in Colorado, Cory Gardner. He's part of the Cory caucus in the Senate. When I saw him stand on the floor angrily defending his state's decision, you can see how much it's moved from the experience of a lot of legislators. And so I think that we see momentum growing. People who were skeptics or cynics before are being converted, and we're just gaining momentum. So I'm excited about what's happening in New Jersey. Again, New Jersey is a tale of two states. I grew up in the northern parts of Bergen County. First African-American family to move in a predominantly white neighborhood. My friends, as Ro was telling the story about Chris Hayes, those are the experiences of my friends. And there was just a different justice system for there compared to kids in Camden, compared to kids in Newark, compared to kids in Passaic. And so I think a lot of people are aware from all over our state how unjust this has been, how people's lives have been destroyed. And I think that people are reacting against that, and especially now moving it with more confidence, seeing early mover states like Colorado be so successful.
thank you. We can get to the next question.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Lois Kazakov with San Francisco Chronicle.
Hi there. This is a question probably for Congresswoman Lee. So the bill would expunge the records of people who've been found guilty under the federal laws. What are the parameters of the expungement? I mean, I can understand expunging a record for possession, but if somebody was actually dealing and distributing, that's kind of a different thing. But what are the parameters?
Sure. This bill, what it actually does is provide a process for victims of these overzealous and quite frankly, often racist marijuana enforcement policies. This process is for people who have already served their time and they are out of jail, and now they deserve a process that would allow them to expunge their records. It's for possession and use. And so the parameters of this bill, I think, are very narrowly written, and it focuses on nonviolent offenses, and these are for people who have already done their time.
And I just want to emphasize that the people in prison have to appeal, have to file for expungement. So if you're sitting in prison for possession or use, there's a process. You don't just get out. You have to make sure that you're evaluated in a fair process to make sure you're not a threat in some other way. But I think Barbara Lee laid it plain. When there's no difference in America between blacks and whites for marijuana usage or marijuana distribution, no difference. But African Americans are 3.7 times more likely to be arrested for that. This law has a patentedly racist impact, disparate impact on African Americans, and we should be moving aggressively to do that. Now, some places, and I think it was mentioned earlier, I think you mentioned it earlier, that all of a sudden this is a big business in some communities, and people are rushing to get their licenses. But it's so ironic that this disproportionately affects the ability for African Americans to get into the legal marijuana business. So again, this bill is about correcting action. And this has been a very narrowly written bill, and my hopes that we can get some more Republicans on, as well as just anybody of common sense. This is not going to put anybody in danger. But imagine, and I've met these folks who are trying to get a job. I met somebody with New Jersey Transit when I was online one day at the DMV, who got a job, got hired, but they ran a record check and found out something like 18 years earlier they had one of these nonviolent drug charges. And it crushed his family, and left him in economically challenging straits. And so I'm grateful for Congresswoman Lee, who just lays it plain.
To get the record expunged, do they have to file?
I'm sorry. I think we need to move on to the
federal
next question.
Yeah, she was just asking more
Our
about
next
the
question
process we can explain
comes
that.
from Dominique Holden with BuzzFeed News.
Hello, thank you very much for taking my call. My question is about the support that you can find for it. If you've got new converts like Cory Gardner who are not co-sponsoring the Senate version, as far as I can tell, there's only one co-sponsor in the Senate version. Why do you believe that this has meaningful momentum and can change the dialogue and won't just essentially die on the vine?
Well, it's changed the dialogue already. The bill itself and the other aspects beyond legalization have definitely changed the dialogue. It's something that I'm so excited, the momentum, the movement behind it. When we launched this bill, and this is actually giving it a tremendous more momentum. Now I have a House version being supported by courageous people, 17 co-sponsors. In the United States Senate, I met with Cory Gardner about what are we going to do about the marijuana issue. In that bipartisan meeting we had, they talked about trying to do a fix on Jeff Sessions' recent actions, but to have a larger dialogue now about how to do something more comprehensive and long term. So we'll see how that's going to develop. But I'm excited about the national dialogue that's changing. I'm very excited that people are now pushing not just legalization, but also doing something to deal with the other aspects of the injustices surrounding marijuana enforcement. But again, the fact that I'm sitting here right now with two of the premier members of the House of Representatives and they're leading on this shows that we're gaining more momentum.
Yeah, there have been over 30-some states that have passed legalization or decrim or medical marijuana initiatives or laws. And so I think it's a matter of time. The Grassroots and Drug Policy Alliance and democracy is working. And I think you will see members of the House and Senate move forward because people are, like I said earlier, over 60% of the public support what legalization and decriminalization really is about. And so I don't think this democratic movement can be stopped now at all. Right.
And you see this, I think, with some of the newer members of Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, Republicans like Tom Garrett and others who've spoken out for legalization. So it's amazing that we've already gotten 12 co-sponsors, and I anticipate we're going to get many more and that there's no reason to think that we won't get some Republicans on this bill. I don't think it's partisan in that way.
Awesome. Thank you, BuzzFeed. Next question.
Our next question comes from Carla Marinucci with Politico.
Hi, thanks for having this call. I wanted to just gauge your thoughts about California getting into the legal market as of January 1st, the impact of California being the largest legal cannabis market in the world at this point. What do you think the impact's going to be there? And also, what does this legislation say about the growing clout of the cannabis movement? This is legislation you would never have anticipated even 5 years ago. Just your thoughts on that.
Start.
Well, Carla, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is going to have a huge impact on California's economy. Like I said, nationally, it's almost $40 billion, and I think California itself is $5 to $6 billion potential. And with the Cole memo, that has a lot of people in California concerned about what the Justice Department could do to interfere with the ballot proposition that was passed. I mean, here you have the irony of someone who claims they believes in federalism, undermining states' rights to do things that people in these states have passed. And so that's why I think Senator Booker and Representative Barbara Lee's introducing this legislation is so timely, to stand up for these states, saying even though the Justice Department may not believe in federalism and what Senator Booker said, having our states be laboratories of democracy, people in Congress do. And I think this is going to give a lot of reassurance to people in California.
Carla, also, I want to call your attention to one aspect of this, which is extremely important in terms of the expungement provision and the licensing of this industry, because now, at least in one of my cities in Oakland, now there's a process for those who who live in certain areas where marijuana arrests were higher, or where people were incarcerated for use or low-level marijuana possession crimes. There's a process for licensing for people who have been tragically hurt by the marijuana laws. And so in California, I think we will see, and we've been pushing very hard on this, a more inclusive industry from the ground up. It's very difficult once an industry is established to fight for inclusion and equity in businesses given the current climate. But this is a new day, and I think we'll see more businesses, legal businesses that have actually complied with all of the requirements, will be headed and run by people of color and people who have been negatively impacted by the laws.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Congresswoman. Yes. We're great for next question.
Our next question comes from Jamila Flaherty with The Guardian.
Hey everybody, thanks for having this. I have a question about the racial discrimination ramifications of the bill. After Jeff Sessions rescinded the Cole memo, I took a look at the BJS numbers on federal marijuana prisoners, and was actually surprised to find that Black Americans are actually proportionally represented in that population. And so I'm curious what federal lawmakers can do to push states and local jurisdictions away from punitive marijuana enforcement, because that's actually where the racial disparities mostly start to appear, and because federal prosecution of marijuana is really a very small portion of the overall criminalization picture.
So just so you know, one of the pillars of the legislation is trying to do the reverse of what the 1994 crime bill did, which gave tremendous incentives to states to create more mandatory minimums, tremendous incentives for them to build prisons, resources, and the like. It really helped to supercharge the crime bill. Well, this does the absolute reverse. It takes states that have not gone towards legalization and creates incentives for them to change their marijuana laws. And so we believe by offering that pool and that incentive of resources and potentially sanctions, frankly, that we can actually move states to do the right thing. But you're absolutely right. The overwhelming lion's share of the incarcerated people for marijuana are in the states, and that's why a number of components on this bill gets the federal government out of the state's business by descheduling it, by allowing banks, frankly, to give banking services. A lot of the things in this bill are helping states to do what they can, and I think that by the federal government, by passing a bill like this, you're going to see more state legislators, Republican and Democrat, feel liberated to follow the direction of California, Colorado, Alaska, and others.
Also, in the bill, we just outright cut federal funding.
Yes, that's what I meant
for
by
state
sanctions.
Law enforcement. That means cutting the federal funding for state law enforcement and prison construction.
Yes.
If a state disproportionately arrests and incarcerates low-income individuals and people of color for marijuana offenses, is that
you are saying it right?
Absolutely right.
Federal funding.
Okay, so basically, it takes away the money.
Money talks. We're good for next question. Thank you.
Our next question comes from Andrew Joyce with MIT.com.
MIT.com? MIT.com?
Oh, Mike?
Mike.
Mike.com.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were like from the university. I was like, uh-oh.
You're getting scared.
I thought you were going to ask me something about brain science and something like that. Okay.
No, my question is actually about the political impacts of marijuana laws more broadly. We're seeing a number of candidates, not just in places like California, but in West Virginia's 1st Congressional District, which Trump won by 49 points, and Indiana's 9th Congressional District, where Trump won by something like 27 points. Candidates are running on the issue of legalization of marijuana, specifically as in some cases as a response to the opioid crisis, as an alternative to opioid pain relievers. Would you encourage Democrats across the country to embrace this issue and use it as a 2018 wedge issue, if nothing else, for the broad support of the administration anachronistic view on the issue?
I mean, to me, this is such an obvious issue of the future versus past. I guarantee you there's going to be a day in the United States where marijuana is going to be legalized, and this is going to be the policy. The question is it going to happen in 2 years, in 4 years, in 10 years? But it's obvious to me. Sometimes I wonder if, and I don't mean this as a snide comment, if Attorney General Sessions has sat down with millennials, and does he, see their tweets, or is he on Facebook? Has he talked to people under 50? So I think it's a clear issue where at least people, the younger generation, it's obvious that this should be the policy, and I would encourage people to run on it in the sense that it is something that is going to have the majority opinion of this country.
Yeah, accountability is an issue in a democracy, and I think what we're going to see, it's going to be the voices of the people which will be reflected in candidates' position on this issue. And I say that because public opinion is telling us and showing us that that's where the majority of the public and our constituents are, and candidates will catch up with their voters very soon.
Amen. Well, your last question?
This is the last question. I got that alert now.
Oh, you got the alert?
This is our last question, so
okay.
Last words. Can you take one more?
Okay.
One more. We can do one more.
One more.
Okay.
One more.
Our next question comes from Janet Burns with Forbes Online.
Thank you so much for your time. I wanted to ask about the use of fundings that are raised by the bill. In terms of community reinvestment, which of any of the services listed in the bill would specifically center on marijuana, for example, with job training or health education? And would any of these funds from, as described there, or from the mentioned special purpose funds, go to creating minority equity in the cannabis industry?
Well, I think that I'll just comment from California's perspective. In my district, we're establishing local requirements for equity and inclusion, and so I would think and hope that any state that receives these funds from the Community Investment Fund would put together equity and inclusion provisions. the money, the $500 million would go to invest in, and let me just list some of the provisions of the bill for the types of programs: job training, reentry, community centers, legal assistance, whatever is necessary to ensure that there's restorative justice. But in that overall process, of course, inclusion and equity has got to be the guidepost and the framework on which this money will be disseminated, evaluated, and organized around. Senator Booker.
I just want to, as a former mayor, getting access to dollars for common sense stuff that we know works in helping to empower people to combat poverty. There's so many just programs, from job training programs, frankly, from healthcare programs. I can give you lots of data on the correspondence between investing in things like healthcare and job training, education, how it relates directly towards economic empowerment for a community. So for communities to be focused on, targeted by the drug war, disempowered, this is a bill that's going to try to address those things. This bill does not, I don't want anybody to get the wrong impression, create investment streams for marijuana businesses. However, what Barbara Lee is talking about to me is one of those things that actually irk me, is that when something becomes profitable, suddenly you see a lot of folks being squeezed out of it. I've seen that in everything from things that once weren't okay that now are okay. Suddenly, it's harder pathways for poor folks, low-income folks, women, and minorities to get a chance to get a fair seat at the table. And so I'm so grateful for the leadership of Barbara Lee as she's working in her state, and as my state moves in that direction. You can be sure, from the governor's office to the state legislators to others, I'm going to be beating the drum that we shouldn't just be legalizing, but we should find ways for inclusion, for equity, for economic opportunity for all.
One comment, and then I have something I want to close with.
I'll just close with this. I was listening to a recent interview of President Obama, and he said that Michelle Obama understood something before he did, which was the cultural impact of political leadership. That more than passing a bill or getting a particular policy, political leaders actually can shape values and shape conversation. And I know that the question was asked about the racially disparate impact being more in the states than the federal government. But I think more than anything in this bill, the leadership that Senator Booker and Barbara Lee have provided is going to force a conversation across America about this issue, and that the Drug Policy Alliance has provided. And to me, that's the highest form of political leadership, and actually changing people's mindsets about an issue that was stuck in outdated thinking. And
because I want Barbara Lee to have the last word, so I just want to extend my thanks again to the Drug Policy Alliance and to Congresswoman Lee for their leadership. It does mean a lot when you're stepping out on issues that are not popular in Congress. You're going a bit against the grain, that you're understanding what the arc of the moral universe, which way it's bending, and to stand there with them. Their leadership to me right now is exciting and energizing, and should be to the entire national movement, even though they're Californians. The reality is we're making a national statement today that this progress on these bills are going a long way. And I love what Congressman Khanna said about you just never know when something like this is going to break. There were moments, I still remember people, almost like a year before marriage equality, people didn't believe it was going to happen, and suddenly we were there. This is something that we just need more and more people. As much as our leadership is important, the old saying down here in Washington is change doesn't come from Washington, it comes to Washington. And so we're hoping that this bill will excite and energize people in the grassroots to continue to push for change. With that, I bring you my friend, my colleague, Barbara Lee, for the last word.
Well, let me close by just first recognizing the fact that Senator Booker now is on the Judiciary Committee with Senator Kamala Harris. Historical appointments. And so we have a lot of hope. And all of the questions that have been asked, I thank the press for being on this call, because, I think that we have to communicate to the public that there's a shining light in all of this darkness, many shining lights. And Senator Booker, Senator Harris, and others, Congressman Ro Khanna, they're providing that light in the midst of this darkness, and light always overtakes the darkness. And so we will win this. I wanted to just say, with regard to the opioid crisis, we have fought so hard and will continue to fight for treatment and resources to go to communities that are affected by the opioid crisis. We want people to go into treatment, not into jail. And I think this moment around the debate about the tragedy around opioids gives us an opportunity to talk about the tragedy around marijuana. And we need to understand that those who have been affected by marijuana possession and use, they do not need to be incarcerated, and they should be provided with restorative justice. And we are definitely going to fight to make sure that those who have been affected by opioids don't have to go down that path. And we're going to finally end this war on drugs with this legislation. So thank you to the Drug Policy Alliance very much. And I have something I'd like to give to my friends here, because we in the Bay Area, we say stay woke. Stay woke.
I love that.
Stay woke.
All right.
Because we're going to win this. Thank you very much.
Hard to follow up with that, but thank you so much.
Love this. I love
Sincerely
this.
grateful for the leadership at this table, and we're ready to close out. Thank you for everyone on the line, and thank you for everyone on Facebook Live. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.